Welcome to another Grand Rounds. It's nice to see so many people here. A little louder. All right. My name is Aditya Lati, and I'm one of the Grand Rounds co-directors, along with Doctors Alex Harris and Rebecca Mueller. Today, Dr. Harris is online for the Zoom component. Following today's Grand Rounds, there'll be a luncheon in the multipurpose room for trainees who have signed up. Okay. Next week, we have a special Grand Rounds, which is part of our early series, Investigator series. The speakers will be Alessia Mastrodonato, Weili Chang, and Zi Zhu. This Grand Rounds will be in person, so we hope you could attend. Before we begin today's Grand Rounds, just a few housekeeping notes. We encourage people to ask questions. If you're on Zoom, you don't need to wait till the end. You could post your questions during the talk. Please use the Q&A feature, not the chat feature. If you're a trainee, please indicate you're a trainee, as we like to prioritize trainee questions. Finally, please indicate if you'd like to ask the question yourself, and we'll promote you temporarily to panelist. So again, use the Q&A feature, indicate if you're a trainee, and say, I'd like to ask my question myself. All right? So today we're really thrilled to have a very, very special speaker, Dr. Katherine Keyes, who's a professor of epidemiology right across the street at Mailman School of Public Health. Dr. Keyes got her bachelor's at the University of Minnesota, and then did both her MPH and her PhD here at Columbia Mailman. After that, she rose very rapidly from postdoc to assistant professor and now full tenured professor in the department. Her research focuses on psychiatric and substance use epidemiology across the life course. She is particularly focused on methodological challenges in estimating age, period, and cohort effects, as well as using mathematical models and agents to inform public health and policy interventions. Her work has been funded by a myriad of organizations, including NIAAA, NIDA, NIDA, NIMH, CDC, et cetera, et cetera. In preparing for this introduction today, I was looking at her CV, and there's only one word to describe it: frightening. It is so accomplished. Just to give you a few examples, she is an author of more than 450 peer-reviewed articles, and she has an H index of 102. For those who are not familiar, that means she has more than 100 publications that have each been cited more than 100 times. That's very, very rare. Most recently, she's serving as the director of the Social Psychiatry Innovation in Research, Implementation, and Training Initiative here at Mailman School of Public Health, and she's going to be talking about some elements of that during her talk as well. Her talk is titled Suicide Clusters, Spatial and Temporal Correlations, and the Environmental and Social Determinants in the United States, Leveraging Novel Methods for Prevention and Intervention. I ran out of breath just saying that. Anyway, on a more personal note, Kerry is just one of the most wonderful, gracious, and loving colleagues we could ever have, and I'm hoping, given the work she does and the work we do, that there'll be lots of scope for new collaborations after this. So please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Katherine Keyes.
Thank you so much for that very lovely introduction that I hope I can live up to today. Let's see. Okay. As Adi mentioned, my very long title of this presentation is Suicide Clusters, Spatial and Temporal Correlations, and their Environmental and Social Determinants in the United States, Leveraging Novel Methods for Prevention and Intervention. And I'm particularly excited to present some of this work to this group because, you know, this is very classic epidemiology that I'm going to present to you. It's very much a 10,000-foot view of what we know from the data, our trends in suicide in the United States, and how we can use novel methods to unpack some of those trends. And so I think that that works really well with a lot of the clinical expertise in the room, and I hope that we can have a good dialogue there. I have no financial relationships to disclose for this work. I do expert witness work and litigation, so I wanted to disclose that as well. The last time I was here presenting Grand Rounds was, I looked it up, it was in 2012. And I was a new assistant professor in the department and very nervous to be presenting in front of this group. And I had a really young child at home. And I remember feeling kind of out of body, that experience of being kind of a new parent and changing diapers at home and then coming and presenting to this very accomplished group of people. And so it really feels good to be back here 12 years later now. And I wanted to just share a little bit of my personal story before launching into it, because after that talk in 2012, about a year later, my marriage fell apart and I got divorced. And several years after that, my ex-husband died by suicide here in New York City. My son was 7 years old at the time. This is the last picture I have of them together. And so I became one of the many families that is changed by suicide loss. And this topic has taken on a very personal interest of mine to really try to understand how we can prevent and intervene for these really tragic deaths that affect so many people, including my family. Okay, so with that out of the way, I'll get back to the data, which is something I'm much more comfortable living in. These are the trends in recorded suicide in the United States, starting back to 1900 and going through 2019. And a few things that are notable that I think we should notice to start this conversation. One is that there has been huge variations over time in, again, the recorded suicide rate. We don't know what the true suicide rate are, but this is what we have in the vital statistics system. A second is that, throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, there was a real decline in the suicide rate in the United States. But after about 2000, we've been really seeing major increases in the suicide rate, so that if we look at 2020 data, we're really not that far in terms of progress in intervening on the suicide rate than we were over 100 years ago. It's about the same as it was in 1900. So what I do is kind of take apart these trends over time, and particularly focusing on this increase since about 2010. And I take apart those data, try to analyze how are these suicide deaths clustered in space and time and by demographic group. And the analysis of suicide clusters has a really long history in epidemiology, including a very illustrious history in this department with Mattie Gould's, of course, seminal work. Some of the first documented suicide clusters were in the 1700s. Probably a lot of people know this story of the Sorrows of Young Werther, which is this book by Goethe that was very popular, published in 1774. And in the book, there's a young man who takes his own life after experiencing unrequited love. And there were many reports throughout Europe of people who were affected by this book, dressing like young Werther, taking their own lives in a similar type of manner as young Werther, and to the point where now when we talk about some suicide clusters, especially after fictional or non-fictional depictions of a suicide death, we call it a Werther effect. And we know very well throughout the world that this Werther effect exists. This is the most recent meta-analysis of the increase in the suicide rate per population after the inappropriate reporting of a celebrity suicide death. There have been many studies in many different countries that overall converge that there's about a 13% increase in suicide death in a country after a celebrity suicide is inappropriately reported by the media. We saw that here in the United States, and my colleagues and I documented this after the death of the entertainer Robin Williams, which happened in 2014. Shown here is the suicide rate by month in 2010, 11, 12, 13, and this was the month that Robin Williams died. And using a spatial temporal scan model, we estimated what the expected number of deaths were in the 6 months after Robin Williams died and what the observed were. And we attributed about 1,800 excess suicides over and above what would be expected given seasonality and given annual increases to the death of Robin Williams in the United States. So this overall picture of these suicide clusters, these suicide cases that cluster in space and time, led me and my colleagues in environmental health sciences, actually, and in infectious disease, to start to think about how we can conceptualize suicide death through the classic tools that we have in epidemiology. And anyone who's taken an intro epidemiology class knows that we often take a disease and we separate its risk factors by agent, host, and environmental factors. And, host factors are those that I think are very well studied clinically, and most people in this room are intimately familiar with as risk factors for suicide, such as psychiatric disorder history, previous attempts, stressful life events, and other types of acute events like that. But what I study in the epidemiology of suicide is more often in these other two buckets. What are the environmental factors? What is the seasonality of suicide, and how is that changing across age? What are the temperature, altitude, and macroeconomic factors that influence the suicide rate? And then these agent factors as well. How is the media reporting suicide deaths? What are the agents of suicide deaths, such as firearm ownership? And it's through this triangulation of agent, host, and environmental factors that we can really start to understand the spatial patterning of suicide deaths. And I'll give you an example of that now. But first, I'll tell you my outline. I'm going to start with some spatial correlations. Then I'm going to show you some temporal correlations and how we use age period cohort effects to disentangle environmental trends, how we're using spatial and temporal correlation now for prediction of suicide rates at a population level, and then some of the data that we're developing on new risk factors. So in terms of spatial correlations, what we often do with suicide data is we create these spatial temporal scan windows. That is, we take suicide deaths across the United States by county, and we create these cylindrical scan windows that we can vary in space and time. And we estimate the extent to which suicide deaths are more correlated in a particular place and time than we would expect if there's no temporal or spatial component to suicide death at all. If suicide deaths are truly random, or if they're only based on host factors, if the environment doesn't play much of a role, we wouldn't expect any spatial clustering. So we create these statistical models that are agnostic to mechanism, right? We're just estimating how much spatial correlation is there. What size is it? Where is it located? And I'll show you some of our results on that for current suicide deaths. This looks like a mess right now, but you'll understand it in several minutes. So these are temporal clusters of suicide rates among young people. This is people aged 5 to 25 in the United States. And each of these graphs, the x-axis is time. So we're starting in 2000, and this goes through 2020. And the y-axis is the relative risk. So this indicates how much greater the suicide risk is in a particular place and time compared to what we would expect if there's no spatial clustering. And then each of these little bars is a suicide cluster. And by that, I mean the correlation of suicides in that cluster is higher than we would expect if there's no spatial clustering. The number here, like this is the number 11, indicates the number of counties that are in that cluster. So this data point right here is a set of 11 counties where between about 2006 and 2008, the relative risk of dying by suicide, if you were a 5 to 25-year-old in those 11 counties, was 4 times higher than we would expect if there was no spatial clustering whatsoever. So a few things emerged from, now that you understand each data point, kind of broadening it out. One is that you've got way more spatial correlation in later years than in the early years of this time series. You can't even distinguish between these points. There are so many suicide clusters. And what this indicates is that over time, the rate of change by place is increasing. The places where suicide risk is high are getting higher, and the places where suicide risk is low are getting lower. So you have way more heterogeneity by county in suicide rates. The other thing that is apparent from this graph is that the relative risk is increasing. So down here, the relative risk was around 2. Now the relative risk is around 3 or 3.5. So that indicates that not only is the number of suicide clusters increasing, but the magnitude of the risk of death in those clusters is also increasing. Another important component to this is you see a bunch of these bars that are below 0. And what does that indicate? Those are what we call cold clusters. Those are areas of the US where the risk of dying by suicide is lower than we would anticipate if there was no clustering of suicide deaths. So these are really important clusters too in order to understand, and I'll give you an example of why. So this is the same data, but now mapped to the United States. So this is all of those clusters that we observed on the previous slide. Now this is where they're occurring in the US. And you can see when you look across all racial and ethnic groups, You see, really correlation across the whole US, but really concentrated in the Midwest and in the mountains. And then you've got these cold clusters that are really emerging on the coast. But again, when we stratify by racial ethnic group, some interesting suicide prevention identification tools emerge. One being that, for example, for Asian and Pacific Islander young people, you've got clusters on the coast that are not necessarily apparent for other racial ethnic groups. For Black populations, the clusters are really concentrated in the South. And I'll point you towards this graph for American Indian and Alaska Native populations, where we see a very high rate of suicide compared to other racial ethnic groups. And yet we see these cold clusters, which is curious because we know that the rate of suicide is quite high for this racial ethnic group. Well, again, this method is completely agnostic to causality. We do know that this region of the US is primarily Apache territory, where they had a very widespread suicide prevention intervention in the early 2000s that reduced the youth suicide rate about 23%. And so we think that this cold cluster that we're observing, compared to other areas of the US where American Indian and Alaska Native people reside, is the result of a public health campaign to reduce suicide that was effective. We also took the suicide rates across the US by county, and we organized them by their rate. So we conducted a latent class analysis where we took all of the counties across these 20 years, and we organized them by their suicide rate. So we estimated how many clusters of counties can we estimate based on the data alone that would be characterized by intercept and slope. And we also included a bunch of economic time varying factors. But essentially what the data show is that suicide in the United States can be divided into 5 different groups. Those with the highest rate are about 5% of counties in the US. Those with the lowest rate are about 17% of counties in the US. And these counties are really distinguished by where they started. So the intercept. The counties with the lowest suicide rate in 2020 were the counties with the lowest suicide rate in the year 2000. And same for the highest risk counties. And this is where those counties are located. And once again, you can see, the highest risk counties are those that are orange and green. And you can see that those are primarily in the mountains, especially sparsely populated counties in the Mountain West as well as the Midwest. And you've got these lower risk counties all along the coast of the US. And one thing that's important when you look at this data is that we could not identify a cluster of counties in the US statistically where the suicide rate is going down. Even in the lowest risk suicide cluster group, the suicide rate is increasing. And that was really a surprise to me. When I started, I thought, oh, we're going to identify, there must be a group of counties that are doing really well in suicide prevention. Unfortunately, we did not identify a group of counties like that. So that is kind of the spatial mapping of suicide in the US and where the highest risk groups are. But another component of the work that we do in epidemiology is to map the temporal correlations as well. And we do that through age period cohort mapping. So now I'm going to transition the types of maps that I'm showing you from maps of the US to maps of time. And again, don't be scared. I'm going to walk you through this. But these are, again, all of the suicides in the United States, starting in the year 2000. And now we organize them very differently. So I'm going to walk you through this age period cohort map right here. Each of these dots is an hexagonal array of person time that crosses an age, a period, and a cohort. So from this graph, you can see that the cohort is on this axis here, and the cohorts are getting consistently older as you go up. So these are the youngest cohorts down here. The cohorts are getting older. This is time period on this axis. You can see period is getting more recent. We start in time period 2000, and we go all the way to 2020. And then on this third axis is age. You can see the age starts in childhood, and then age goes up to older adulthood. So within each age period cohort hexagon, we arrange what the suicide rate is for that triad. And a few things emerge. One, you see a big age effect, right? The suicide rate, and also the darker colors are when the suicide rate is low, and then we go up to red, and the highest risk groups are in blue. And I also stratified these by firearm and non-firearm, and these are deaths for men on the left and then deaths for women on the right. So you can see that the suicide rate is going up across age. I don't think that's going to be a surprise to most people, but you do see the rates going up and up and up, and that the highest risk of a firearm suicide death is men in older age. But you also see this big clustering of red right here, right? That emerges quite stunningly visually when you organize the data in this way. And this is a cohort effect. We have men who are born in the 1950s and 1960s who are emerging through the life course in about their age 50 to 60 year range, where their suicide rates are higher than men of that age born in previous cohorts. You see the same kind of cohort effect emerging for women for non-firearm suicide deaths. The cohort starts a little bit younger, and you can see that red extending all the way down. And we're going to get into that in more detail as well. But that cohort effect is really emerging for young women, predominantly for non-firearm suicide. Oh, I'm sorry, you're right. I saw what you're saying. It's down here that you see for women. I apologize. Here is the cohort effect for women, and then you see it emerging down to younger ages as well. Okay, but we're going to return to that because I want to talk a little bit about the epidemiology of firearm suicide death in the United States. Also, before getting there, I do want to point out that we've also done this analysis stratified by race ethnicity to detect emergent disparities. And we just published this year this same hexagonal map for Black women in the United States, where there is a major emerging cohort effect for suicide for young Black women that's outpacing increases that we're seeing for other racial ethnic groups. So when we look particularly by the method of suicide death, and particularly for that cohort effect for women that is getting younger and younger and younger, what we're observing, which I think is important for clinicians to know, is that we're also seeing changes in the method of suicide death. So these are trends over time in the proportion of all suicide deaths that are due to asphyxiation, firearm, and any other method. And what we can see is that for males, there was a decrease in the proportion of suicides that were by firearm and an increase in the proportion of deaths due to asphyxiation, especially in the mid part of the 2010s. That's now diverging again. We're starting to see an increase in firearm suicides among men as well. And for women, we've seen this extraordinary increase in the proportion of suicide deaths that are due to asphyxiation. And I do think that that's important clinically because, especially for public health, we have a lot of discussion about preventing firearm suicides and what we can do to prevent lethal means. When we're talking about asphyxiation deaths, it's very difficult to prevent access to a lethal mean outside of an institutionalized setting. And so the focus has to be more on preventing the underlying suicidal crisis. And just to show you these rates by race and ethnicity, especially among women, if you look in the first part of our time series, 1999 to 2021, less than half of deaths for white, Black, and Asian women were due to asphyxiation, and now it's well over half. For American Indian or Alaska Native women, now 3/4 of all suicide deaths are due to asphyxiation. And we see much more stable changes among men. So we wanted to really figure out the extent to which the increases that we're seeing in suicide death in the United States are contributed to by trends in firearm use. If you see increases in suicide death in the United States, you know that access to a firearm is the most lethal method of suicide death. It begs the question, to what extent are changes in the firearm ownership rate contributing to the increases in suicide death that we're seeing? This is hard to estimate because we don't have access to reliable data on firearm ownership in the US. And the best that we got was an estimate of the household firearm rate that was developed through a factor analysis by the RAND Corporation. And this incorporates a number of different metrics, things like subscriptions to gun and ammo, things like other indicators of firearm ownership. They bring in BRFSS data on self-reported firearm ownership, but then augment it with all these other components as well. One component that they they include in their rate is the firearm suicide, the proportion of suicide deaths that are by firearm. We took out that indicator because our outcome was firearm suicide deaths, but the correlation was still quite high. So this is, and importantly, they only have the data through 2016. So anyone who's looking to collaborate, we would love to update this data after 2016. So this is the estimated firearm ownership rate from 1999 to 2016, and you can see that the line is completely flat, basically. This is the firearm suicide rate, and you can see that increase that occurs, starting in the 2000s. The first thing we did, and then we conducted a mediational analysis. How much did changes in the firearm ownership rate explain increases in the firearm suicide rate? The first thing we did was we organized the household firearm suicide ownership rate to the firearm suicide rate by state. So you can see that the lowest rates of for household firearm rates are in New Jersey. The highest rates are in Montana. If you look at the correlation between the household firearm rate and the firearm suicide rate, that correlation is 0.81. So almost all of the variation by state in the US in the firearm suicide rate is predicted by how many people own a firearm. However, none of the temporal association is predicted by changes over time in the firearm ownership rate. And that is predictable because that line is so flat. So all of the spatial variation, almost all of the spatial variation in firearm suicide deaths is attributable to how many states have more guns, but none of the temporal variation is predicted by changes over time in firearm ownership rates. However, this is only through 2016. And there have been a lot of reports, especially since COVID, that firearm ownership rates are increasing in the US. So the extent to which these results generalize past 2016 remains unknown. So we have engaged in a lot of work to try to move from this epidemiological side of things to looking at prediction. And in doing so, we tried to incorporate this spatial and temporal correlation. A lot of people in this room who study suicide have probably been involved in prediction projects where you're trying to predict who will die by suicide. And available prediction models have largely been less than excellent when you're using kind of clinical data to predict who's going to die by suicide. There's been a lot of discussion that, suicide is unpredictable. It's a rare event. It's very hard to use available data to try to predict it. And we wanted to see if we could use spatial variation in order to predict rates of suicide in the United States that would go above and beyond what those individual level prediction models could do. So we created a prediction model with all sorts of factors, such as the unemployment rate, the weekly wage, the proportion of the population living in poverty, the household income, proportion using this RAND score that we have, the proportion living in a firearm owning household, the proportion of the population with a major depressive episode by state using the NISDA data, and the population per square mile. And what we found is that you can get a really good prediction using just that select set of variables of what the suicide rate is going to be in any place in the US. So this is an estimate of how well our models are doing, and they're doing generally very well, whether we use a full or a select set of indicators. The other thing I want to point out here is that these prediction models also show you that heterogeneity of suicide risk. This increased slope here means that the difference between a high-risk county and a low-risk county is growing over time. And this is what we found in our other analysis as well. There's an increasing disparity in the United States by county of where suicides are occurring. The spatial correlation itself is growing. So the highest risk counties are becoming more high risk, and the lowest risk counties are becoming more low risk. And that's what this statistic shows you. And these are our prediction models. Here is the observed data on suicide rates in the US. And this is just what our model would predict the suicide rate would be using that select set of variables that largely focused on economic conditions. And this is the error left over afterwards. And you can see that our error is generally pretty good. Basically our model very accurately predicts what we observe to occur. And if anything, our model underreports what the suicide rate would be. So now we're using this type of model in a forecasting framework that if we can accurately predict what's actually going on in the United States, we might be able to predict what's going to happen in the United States as these economic conditions change. We're also incorporating new and novel sources of data. We've partnered with the Suicide Lifeline, and we got all of their data on every call to the Suicide Lifeline at geographic levels in the US for about the past 20 years. And we're using that Lifeline data now as an additional predictor of where suicide risk will occur. And one thing we did just to get a handle on the data, this is kind of a sloppy map of the US. If you can kind of think about like, this is the Northeast over here, here's Maine and Vermont and New Hampshire, down here is Florida, Texas, Arizona, Hawaii. So if you like, you know, it's like one of those pictures where you like have to fuzzy your eyes a little bit and then you can see the United States. But we created a metric of the call rate ratio. So this is how many more people are calling the Suicide Lifeline in the United States compared to the national average by state, and how many people are dying by suicide compared to the national average in the United States. So things that are below the line mean that a state is lower than the national average, and things that are above the line means the state is above the national average. And the black line is how many calls to the Suicide Lifeline are occurring, and the gray line is the mortality rate, the suicide mortality rate. So a state like California is kind of what you want to see, right? This is a state where there's a lot of calls to the Suicide Lifeline. They're well over the national average, and the suicide rate is pretty low, right? So this is kind of what you want to see. But you've got a lot of other states where that is flipped. You look at a state like Kentucky, a state like Tennessee, you've got a much higher suicide rate than the national average, and their call rate to the Lifeline is very low. You also have states that are remarkably variant over time. A state like Pennsylvania, that 10 years ago, there was tons of calls to the Suicide Lifeline, and now they're below the national average. So organizing the data in this way gives you some leverage to try to think about where these there needs to be more structural supports in place to support crisis helplines and labor force to support that. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some new risk factors, COVID-19, and some of the other work that we're doing in my group to try to understand the impact of these risk factors. I think it will not be a surprise to most people in this group that adolescent mental health has been the topic of a lot of attention because of the increase in the rate. Shown here is our data from a study that I work on called Monitoring the Future, which is a nationally representative study of 8th, 10th, and 12th graders in the United States. We've been conducting surveillance on adolescent mental health since 1976, using the exact same measures every single year throughout that entire time series in nationally representative yearly surveys. And what we found, this is for all of the kids going back to 1991, this is boys and this is girls, and you can see that for both boys and girls, there have been huge increases in the mean level of, this is mostly depressive symptoms, since about 2009. At the same time, I think it's worth noting, we talk a lot about the increases in adolescent internalizing problems. There have been extraordinary decreases over that same time in adolescent externalizing problems. That is the blue line here. This is the mean levels of kids reporting that they get into fights, that they steal something worth more than $50, that they damage property, things like that. That's been going way down. And these self-reports here track very closely with adolescent arrest rates. We have also used the Monitoring the Future data to try to unpack sort of both of those trends together a little bit more. And one way that we have done this, Monitoring the Future asks an extraordinary number of questions about what adolescents do with their time. How often do you go to movies? How often are you on dates? How often do you go to the mall? How often do you read books? Do you participate in sports? I mean, anything that an adolescent can be doing with their time, we measure it in Monitoring the Future. And again, we have been using the exact same measure since 1976. And there have been extraordinary changes in how adolescents spend their time. Essentially, they're less social. And I don't think this is a surprise to most people who probably are treating adolescents in this room and people who are following the literature. But if you look at the early 1990s, almost 40% of students were in a cluster of time use that we labeled highly social and engaged. These are kids spending a lot of time with friends, doing their homework, participating in things like sports, you know, just kind of a social engaged kid. And you can see that by 2020, that's about half. Half of kids are in that group that we call highly social and engaged. Many more kids are in this group that we call medium social. They're just kind of lower on every single one of those metrics. And there also have been major increases, in fact, almost a tripling of students who are in the low social group. These are kids who are not going on dates. They're not hanging out at the mall. They're not doing really anything that is interacting with other adolescents. And so this has prompted, of course, and many people in this room have been doing this, major research into things like smartphones and social media use and whether those are risk factors. And by and large, what the meta-analyses show is that things like time spent on social media is not highly correlated with mental health problems. But also what that literature shows is that there are some particular risk factors online that are particularly pernicious with respect to mental health. And that's what we have spent the last year studying with Nora Kelsall, who's here in the room, is the first author of this paper. And in particular, when you ask adolescents now where they found, adolescents who've survived a suicide attempt, if you ask them now how they got information on how to kill themselves, over 3/4 say that they found the information online. So the internet is, well, there's many great ways to connect with other adolescents on the internet. It's also emerging as this source of damaging and dangerous information, especially with respect to suicide risk. So there was an article a couple years ago in the New York Times about these particular types of sites that are oftentimes unmoderated. Oftentimes you don't need age verification to log on, although some of that has changed somewhat. But this is where adolescents are going. They're chatting with other adolescents who are encouraging them to die by suicide. And in fact, what we showed is that even if you look just at the publication of that New York Times article itself, which did name one of the major contributors to these sites in the article, you can see a big spike in the Google search volume for that particular suicide site the week that the New York Times posted their story. But even after that, there was an interruption in the time series. There have been more Google searches for that particular site since the New York Times published their article than there were before publishing the article itself. We also have taken the Google extended trends data on searches for this particular site and on other what we call pro-suicide websites and tried to correlate that with trends in suicide death, asking the question, is one of the reasons that there's an increase in suicide death because people are logging on and finding out lethal ways to die? And the answer is maybe. So we took this is just ecological data, right? This is purely messy Google searches for these particular sites. We don't know information on people who are accessing sites outside of Google. We don't know if people who are accessing these sites are seriously in a suicidal crisis, or if they're curious, or, I myself have had to Google these sites a bunch and I get so many warnings, please call 988 all the time. So you do get a lot of warnings. We don't have information, but we do have the relative search volume for these states. And what we did was we conducted these distributed lag models for the association between the number of Google searches in a particular month in the US and the number of suicide deaths. So if you look at this graph down here, this is the relative search volume for pro-suicide websites in the United States. And the y-axis here is a lag. So if someone searches for a suicide website today, is that correlated with the number of suicide deaths by month in the same month, 1 month later, 2 months later, 3 months later, et cetera. And as the red color indicates an increase in risk, the blue color indicates a decrease in risk. So overall, if you look at the United States, there's no significant associations between search volumes and the number of suicide deaths, either total, and this is for people aged 10 to 24 only, or when you stratify by sex. But when you stratify by method, you do see a strong signal of an association. In particular, we see anything that's circled in black here as statistically significant associations. And as the red gets darker, the association gets stronger. So you can see that at a lag of 0 months, there's a strong association, about a risk ratio of 1.8 for the relative search volume and suicide deaths from suffocation, as well as you can see a signal of an increase for poisoning as well. Interestingly, you get a negative association for firearms. So as the number of searches for pro-suicide websites increases, the number of firearm suicide deaths in the US decreases. And while we were originally perplexed by this. And again, noisy data, these are ecological associations. There could be a lot going on. It is true that on these websites, suffocation and poisoning are the two methods that are most often recommended, and firearm deaths are most often discouraged. Because if you survive a firearm suicide death, you're much more likely to be experiencing a lifelong disability. So suffocation and poisoning deaths are the methods that are most commonly mentioned. And we do see similar associations for adults. So this is just total age 25 to 64 by male and by female, especially among women, especially for poisoning deaths. And we did a lot of sensitivity analyses to make sure that we were appropriately adjusting for trends in fentanyl exposure and things like that, which are also trending in the United States. And the same results apply if you remove, for example, opioid-related poisonings, that there is an increase, particularly among women, in searches for pro-suicide websites with poisoning deaths. And again, that is the method that's most commonly recommended. So moving on to what we know from COVID-19, there was a big suggestion that there was going to be a lot of increase in suicide deaths during COVID-19. There was an increase in risk factors. There was social isolation. Many people thought we were going to be experiencing a population level increase in suicide deaths in the United States. We have, now there's like many meta-analyses and systematic reviews showing that if you look at psychological distress and some indicators of, kind of temporary depression and anxiety symptoms, there were big increases across the world in those types of symptoms in the early phases of the pandemic. But suicide rates, by and large, in most countries did not increase. This is kind of the first, the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, and you can see in the United States, in most areas, there was either no change in the suicide rate or a decline in the suicide rates across the US. And that was true across the subsequent years as well. It's the first time in almost 20 years that we've really seen a leveling off and a start of a decline in suicide deaths in the United States, which was during the COVID-19 period. When you look at kids in particular, an interesting data point is that this is the kind of early months of the pandemic. This is the suicide rate among adolescents in 2018 to 2020. And you can see that the suicide rate declined pretty significantly for those adolescents in those months in the early stages of the pandemic. The suicide rate approximately matched what it is during the summer, which we know for adolescents, the suicide rate is lower in the summer than it is during school months, presumably because there's a lot of risk factors for suicide that kids encounter in school. And so when you took them out of school, the suicide rate went down. But you can see that as schools reopened, we had a rebound of the suicide rate. And so now there's not a statistically significant decrease change from 2018 to 2020, but the rates are higher as schools started to reopen again in the United States. So we were interested in looking at this in terms of the novel sources of data that we have access to. And I was fortunate to be working with Jeff Shaman, who is doing a lot of COVID modeling for the New York Times. And he had access to millions of cell phone records, the SafeGraph data, where we could characterize in the United States the proportion of time that a device was left at home by day in the US, and then the proportion of time that there was a 24-hour period where your cell phone never left home. And we thought, well, we can correlate that with the more rapid surveillance indicators of suicide death that we have. We won't know about suicide deaths until years after COVID, when COVID first started. But we did have access to the Google data and a lot of experience analyzing Google data. And there are a number of meta-analyses now that show correlations between specific searches that you can do on Google that are reliably correlated with suicide death. So in the early months of the pandemic, we took the search terms that in the meta-analyses were supported as indicators of an increase in risk of suicide death. And we tried to correlate that using time series models with the proportion of devices that are left completely at home. And we use all kinds of methods to separate out the noise in the data that are related to two temporal trends from the association that's truly there in the data. So these are adjusted for those underlying trends, and these are lagged at -1, -2, +1, +2. So the positive numbers indicate that as a search in 1 week is correlated, the cell phones in 1 week are correlated with searches in the week after. The negative numbers indicate that searches in 1 week are correlated with cell phones the week after. So kind of the reverse causation. And we started using economic stressors as a proof of principle because we know causally that COVID caused economic stress. Like there's just not an argument about that. And so we wanted to see if this method worked where we can actually use cell phones left completely at home to detect suicidal risk. We thought, well, it should be able to detect economic stressors. It should be able to detect the number of searches for unemployment, benefits, loans, like all of those economic indicators, and it does, especially this indicator of proportion of devices left completely at home. This is nationally, and then in the New York City designated market area, we observed a strong signal for weeks when a device was left completely at home during COVID, more people were searching for unemployment-related search terms, which again we saw that as kind of a proof of principle that this worked. So then we thought, okay, now let's extend this to suicide search terms. And we observed like basically nothing. So down here was the proportion of devices left completely at home. This is where we saw our proof of principle. And each one of these boxes is a p-value, and there's just like nothing going on really across all of the time lags. You'll see like one p-value kind of emerge in some random time, but it doesn't really make sense. We saw a little bit of a stronger signal for time completely at home, but again, that didn't correspond to our proof of principle, so we weren't really sure what to make out of that. And so we thought, well, maybe this Google data is just not very good. We don't know what these people are Googling. We don't have granular information on age and sex, and we only have designated market area for location. Maybe it's just not good. But then 2 years later, when it came out that the suicide rate didn't increase, we thought, maybe those results were right. Maybe there wasn't a correlation between the time that the device was left completely at home and the change in suicide risk. Because when we look 2 years later at the suicide data, it validates what we saw in this analysis. So it gives me a little bit of hope that we can still use Google data to try to be a more rapid and reliable indicator of suicide risk that doesn't have to rely on these very long time lags that we usually have for suicide hospitalization and death data. And now there's much more opportunity to use this and other kinds of data as well, especially as data science firms are increasingly combining and collating data across multiple different types of systems. So to summarize, I think what our work indicates from a public health level, and again, this is the 10,000-foot epidemiology view, suicide continues to be a national health crisis that is spatially and temporally correlated. And that spatial and temporal correlation is really meaningful to understand the distribution across space and time, and for disseminating intervention and prevention efforts where they are needed the most. By understanding the spatial and temporal correlation, we can better inform where those interventions need to be. The increases in suicide deaths are occurring predominantly in non-firearm methods. And as I said before, I think this is really important for clinicians because it indicates that intervening in the suicidal crisis and preventing that is our best shot at reducing the suicide rate in the US. Still, 50% of suicides in the US are by firearm. It doesn't suggest that we need to take our eye off the ball of preventing firearm suicides through lethal means prevention, but it does indicate that intervening to reduce suicidal crisis is increasingly important, especially for women, and especially for women of color. And in that sense, disparities is a key consideration moving forward. As I showed you, the increases in suicide death among young Black girls is by far higher than the increase for any other racial and ethnic group. And so that means specific attention. We don't really understand the impacts of the pandemic at this point, but we do know that we need this rapid surveillance data that goes above and beyond these available data sources with serious time lags. And so we have been focused on developing these novel methods for forecasting and surveillance. So I started this talk with discussion of the sorrows of young Werther, and that this was kind of some of the first what are called copycat suicides from a fictional story. But there's another story that people talk about in the suicide prevention space, and that's the story of Papagano. And there's another effect called the Papagano effect that people talk about. So Papagano was a character in the Magic Flute. Probably some of you New Yorkers are, familiar with it. But Papagano also in the opera experiences unrequited love. And Papagano also decides, like Werther, to take his own life. But unlike Werther, in the story of the Magic Flute, the community comes out. And there are characters in the play who come out and they sing to Papagano that he's a valued member of the community and that he doesn't need to do this. And so I think that that's an important message for all of us, that these deaths are not inevitable. These deaths are preventable. And it really takes a community-wide effort to make sure that we are reaching kids and adults who need it the most to know how valued they are in their lives so we can have more Papagano effects. I'm going to transition to talking a little bit about the initiative that I'm leading through the Mailman School, but I just want to take a moment and thank my co-PI on this R01, Jeff Shaman. I also really want to thank the faculty in the Department of Psychiatry who have been amazing and invaluable co-investigators on this grant, in particular Mark Olofsson and Maddie Gould, but there's a whole group of people, graduate students, postdocs, and data analysts who have really done the heavy lifting on this work. So I want to thank all of them. And then I just want to take a minute and tell you about this initiative that we're starting in the Mailman School and invite anyone who's interested to be a part of it. So the initiative is Social Psychiatry, Innovation and Research, Implementation and Training. And really the genesis for this idea comes from a faculty member in psychiatry, Bruce Stonerendt. We say in PET all the time, we're from the house of Bruce. And I was trained by Bruce Stonerendt throughout my entire research program. And he's been a hugely influential figure in my own research and many people's research here in psychiatry, in the Mailman School of Public Health, and in the world of social psychiatry, and really taking seriously the idea that social determinants of health are crucially important to mental health, and just developing that as an entire field. So social psychiatry really covers political, interpersonal, and cultural dimensions of psychiatric disorders, distress, and well-being. And we, in this initiative, are really trying to think about the legacy of Bruce Stonerendt that we can carry forward to future generations so that all of us can benefit from the training and the foundational work that Bruce did, but in new and novel ways. So we are funding a bunch of different projects. We have funding available. We're bringing in guest speakers who I'll introduce in a minute. And we're doing all kinds of activities to try to just get this idea off the ground and get people involved and interested. We're funding research that is focused on 3 main areas: etiology, mechanisms, and intervention. And within that, we have projects that are related to climate change, technology, inequality. We have projects within mechanisms that are run the gamut from brain development to stress response to more epidemiological studies of loneliness and connection. And of course, funding a lot of intervention work, especially community-based intervention work that addresses disparities in mental health problems. So people who are interested in being involved in that work or getting a project funded, we would love to talk to you and help you do that work. Right now, we have over 50 faculty across Columbia who are involved in the initiative. And there's a lot of people from the Mailman School because that's who I knew. But I've been having a lot of meetings with people in psychiatry, adding people in psychiatry, in engineering, in social work, in psychology, in biostatistics, and all kinds of departments to join this initiative and to generate new research ideas that are within scope. A couple of just words about some of the activities that we're doing. Please tell your students. One of the things that we're leading with the students is a book club. This semester, we're reading When Crack Was King by Donovan Ramsey. We already had our first meeting where we read the first third of the book and discussed it as a group. We're doing 2 more meetings, and then Donovan Ramsey is coming to Mailman and is going to have a Q&A with students on the book. It's really a remarkable book. It's the story of the crack epidemic told by people who survived it, interspersed with a cutting history of the war on drugs and how it's impacted communities across the US. We also have a speaker series. I want to highlight today at 1 o'clock, Dr. Nick Allen will be giving our Spirit talk for this month. And I think that it wasn't planned, but there is, I think, a nice marriage between the broad epidemiology of suicide and then the work that Dr. Allen does to critically analyze different ways to intervene to reduce suicidal crisis. But we have more talks coming up in April and May as well. So please put those in your calendar. And like I said, we're funding different projects. So if we're funding it at an exploratory level. So anyone who has work that is exploratory that you want to get funded, please feel free to let us know and submit an application. So just close by saying that this is an initiative for all of us. It's not a super exclusive club. You just need to let me know that you want to be involved. And then hopefully we can revive social psychiatry throughout Columbia University in the coming years and do work together. So I'll end there and happy to take your questions.